Last class, we ended off with Jesus being called high priest, and that was transition into this new section where we're going to start off with Jesus as the high priest again. And we're going to look at Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15 to chapter 5, verse 10. Let's jump in. A lot of great stuff today. So we start off, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So today we're going to look at the high priesthood and Jesus' humanity and how that correlates with the high priesthood and why that was so important with the high priesthood. And so the first thing that we see here is, again, Jesus is called high priest. And as a high priest, kind of thesis for this section, he is not unable to. So a double negative to emphasize what Jesus does, not unable to sympathize with our weakness. So he is able to see our weakness, and we're going to kind of understand why by the end of this, and has in every respect been tempted as we are. But the good news about Jesus, and this is what's going to distinguish him from every other high priest, is he was found without sin. And so let us draw with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So what is really powerful about this section right here is how the Greek and grammar of the Greek language lend themselves here. Is the high priest, again, not some lofty person in the sky, but how Jesus is called here is that when he sympathizes with us, it is actually a type of suffering together. So if we are going through the pain, Jesus is saying he is going through the pain with us here. And not only is he bringing is he a help in time of need, but this is a very present tense verb, meaning he is active help. He is actively helping us when we are going through temptation, when we are struggling, when we are going to God for help, going to the throne room. He is there. And the throne of grace is essentially to the presence of God. It is going into the Holy of Holies, as was described in the Old Testament, which was something that only the high priest can do on the Day of Atonement, as in Leviticus chapter 16. And so now all of us are being told we can draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, to the Holy of Holies, where the presence of God is. Whereas back then in the Old Covenant, if you tried to get to the Holy of Holies outside of the one day a year the high priest alone was allowed to do, you were struck dead. You were not allowed to enter it. And even sometimes the high priesthood, because they didn't correctly remedy their sin. And so this is an incredibly bold encouragement and bold statement that the author of Hebrews is making here, that Jesus suffers with us as we're being tempted, and he actively helps as we draw near confidently, because we have such a great high priest who understands our pain. And what do we get? We receive mercy and we find grace. Again, mercy is we don't get what we do deserve. So when we receive mercy, we don't get the punishment, the judgment that we deserve, and then we find grace. Grace is the gift from God that we don't deserve. So it is getting something that we don't deserve. So mercy is not getting something we do deserve. Grace is getting something we don't deserve. So we find mercy and we receive grace. We find mercy for our sin. We receive a beautiful salvation, receive grace in our help, in our time of need. So we continue, for every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God. So we're getting into how the author of Hebrews contemplated the role of the high priest. Now, this is not found anywhere in the Old Testament, so this really came out of how the author contemplated the role of high priest, and then how that role of high priest relates to Christ. And so he's making this whole paragraph here is about the high priest in the Old Testament. So if we read it in that light, whenever he says he, his, all of that, we're talking about the high priest. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God. This is what the high priest does, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So he's saying that the high priest himself is a sinner. And so because the high priest has sinned and needs to offer sacrifice for his sin, so before the high priest went into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, he not only offered sacrifice for all of Israel, but he also offered sacrifice for his own personal sin to cleanse him before he went into the Holy of Holies. So because of this, the author says that he is able to understand our ignorance, he is able to understand our weaknesses, because he himself is beset with the same exact weaknesses as we are. So because of that, he can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward. Who's the ignorant and wayward? We are the ignorant and wayward. So this is good news for us, because even in our sinfulness, even the earthly high priest was able to understand that. And then the last part of this paragraph is a kind of humbling fact about the high priest, that no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God. So the high priest, in essence, is an appointed position. It's not a position that someone attains to, meaning that there was nobody who's like, oh, I'm amazing, I can be the one that is the high priest to mediate between God and humans. No, in fact, God is the one who appoints them. So it's not because of something that they can take merit for, but it is something that is appointed, handed to them by God. And he uses the example just as Aaron was. So Aaron was the first high priest under the Torah law of Israel. And so now what we're going to see is how Jesus is greater than Aaron. And since Jesus is greater than Aaron, he's greater than any of the high priests in all of Israel. And so this is, the author then transitions from the earthly high priest to now Christ as high priest. And he says, so also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him. So let's stop there for a second. Again, this is a calling. So even Christ was appointed by God. So he wasn't just saying, oh, I'm the best, here I am, I'm now the high priest. But instead, God appoints him. And then we get two quotations, again, going back to the Psalm. So the first one is from Psalm chapter 2, verse 7, and the second one, Psalm chapter 110, verse 4. Two Psalms that we're already familiar with, that have been quoted in the book of Hebrews already. So the first one from Psalm 2:7. And I want you to pay attention to the titles that are used here for Jesus. So he says in Psalm chapter 2, verse 7, the quote is, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." And then the second quote, as he also says in another place, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." So we have thoroughly gone over how Jesus is the Son. We haven't as much gone over the high priest. And so what the author does here is then he then combines essentially these two titles, these two very important titles, that yes, Aaron was a great high priest, but Aaron never had the title as son. And so immediately he shatters Aaron's pedigree out of the water with the pedigree of Christ, because Christ is called son and priest, which is title that Aaron never got. And so now we get the combination of these two titles that just brings Jesus out greater, that he is greater than Aaron. He is greater than the essentially founder of the high priesthood that Israel worshipped and follow, or that Israel had to help them worship and follow in all the temple rituals. And so now we get Jesus as high priest. So we had, why is the high priesthood and earthly men? How was that good? But now we have Jesus as high priest. And a lot of this, there's allusions, if you want to look at it yourself, to Psalm 116, verses 1 to 6. And so let's read here. "In the days of his flesh, the incarnation, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who is able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence." So this is going to be a really interesting paragraph. So first, we just hear that Jesus is performing his high priestly duties. What is he doing? He's offering up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears. And why is he heard? He is heard by God because of his reverence, because of his posture towards the Father. So again, this is an allusion to Psalm chapter 116, verses 1 to 6. You're going to see all of those elements in this psalm. So the writer is bringing back to another messianic prophecy about Jesus, of who he was. Then we get this really interesting sentence that has thrown off a lot of people, and I think at surface level reading, it can be something that you're kind of like, huh? Doesn't make sense. So let's read. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And so we have been talking a lot about the humanity of Christ, and in this section specifically, the humanity of Christ is what allows Christ to sympathize and help us in our weakness, and because of that is what allows us to draw confidently to the throne of grace. Now, this sentence that we're about to unpack really goes through the humanity of Christ. And so we have to think, Christ was fully God, but also fully man. And so in order to be fully man, he had to experience how us humans experience things. And so we're going to be talking about is experientially as a human, Jesus had to go through these things. For instance, although he was a son, he learned obedience. So although Jesus is who he is, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Now, did he learn it in the way that me and you don't do something and mess up and learn it that way? No. What he did was he experientially learned through suffering. So he understood what it was like to go through suffering in obeying God's will, so that what? He can be a proper high priest from among the people and sympathize with our weakness. And so his learning obedience through suffering, and that word suffering here in Hebrews is constantly being referred to as the passion of Christ or his death. He experientially learned what it means to be obedient through suffering. So when Jesus is sympathizing with us, he's not just kind of giving this false platitude of like, oh, I understand, it's hard, it's going to get better. No, he understands. He actually learned what it means to sufferingly obey. And because of that, he can help us go through it, because as a human, fully human, he fully experienced that suffering to obedience. He experienced when he was in the garden, said 3 times, God, I don't want to do this, but your will, I will. If there's another way, please find it. But yet he still obeys and he goes through it. He experienced, he learned what it means to suffer through the will of God and obey God at all costs, as other scripture says, even to the point of death. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. And so that being made perfect is essentially saying it was validated by God, his perfection. And so the sacrifice that he brought to God as the high priest was then approved because it was a perfect sacrifice. And because of that perfect sacrifice, he becomes the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. Meaning that there is no longer, we don't need another high priest, we don't need another sacrifice. Jesus' sacrifice was perfect, everlasting, once and for all. And Jesus obeyed God, and his cries and supplications were heard. And now we follow Jesus and obey him because of his obedience to the Father. And so when we obey Jesus, what are we promised? That he is his high priestly obedience was validated, accepted as perfect from God, his sacrifice. And now because of that, he is the source of eternal salvation. So we obey him, and he was being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. This whole Melchizedek, I know I mentioned this name a couple of times now. We're going to get more into that in Hebrews chapter 7. There's a section devoted to Melchizedek and his high priestlyhood. But just to close off here, in Christ's humanity, he was showed the full weight of obedience to God and what that meant. And because he did it, and he did it perfectly, and he knows the pain in which it cost, the suffering through which it took to do it, because of that, his sacrifice was accepted. His salvation is now eternal, and he can help us walk through it, to actively help us and sympathize with us while we walk through the frailties of humanity and are tempted with various trials and sins and all the weaknesses that we are beset with, because he experientially learned it himself. And so what a great high priest we have in Jesus. It is an incredible thing to meditate on when you begin to fully realize the humanity of Jesus and what that means for Jesus to have been fully human and to experience weakness, to experience suffering, to experience walking through the will of God, even though it was painful. When you are going through that, know that you have a great high priest who understands it. And when you go to the Holy of Holies, when you go to the presence of God, you will what? Receive mercy and grace. Incredible, incredible things from God. And so because of that, because of Christ being your high priest, you can boldly go before the throne of grace, the presence of God, something that no Israelite was able to do except for the high priest once a year. Now all of us can do freely. And I'll leave you with this. Because of this, what Jesus has done, we have immediate access to the throne, which means we do not need breakthrough in our lives in order to access everything that we need. The breakthrough that we need to get to the presence of God is Jesus, and he already did everything that is needed for us to have breakthrough. And so because of that, we can immediately access the presence of God at any time and at any moment and realize that there's nothing outside of Jesus you need, and Jesus has supplied all that you need and performed all the work as our high priest. Hope you enjoyed today's class. Excited to go deeper in tomorrow and jump into Hebrews chapter 6.